Before the shots of the Civil War echoed across the fields of the United States, there was a country deeply divided by a cruel system that sustained its economy: slavery. In the South, vast plantations of cotton, tobacco, and rice thrived at the expense of the forced labor of millions of enslaved men, women, and children. They were forced to live in precarious slave quarters, small wooden huts where entire families barely fit. Meanwhile, the masters enjoyed the luxury of the grand houses, built as symbols of power and domination. There, every wall seemed to scream the inequality between those who had everything and those who did not even possess their own freedom. The days of the enslaved were marked by endless hours of labor. Under the overseer's stern gaze, the whip cracked as a constant reminder that resistance would be punished with blood. Many were tortured on wooden whipping posts, exposed in front of everyone as an example of forced submission. The branding iron burned the skin of men and women who dared to defy orders. Heavy, cold chains bound bodies and silenced voices. The slave quarters were not just a physical space, they were the living portrait of dehumanization. Meanwhile, the north of the United States moved in the opposite direction. There, industrialization advanced rapidly, with factories, railroads, and growing cities. Many believed the nation's future lay in free, paid labor, not in slavery. Tension grew with each decade because the southern states defended their peculiar institution as essential to their wealth, while the North saw it as a moral stain that needed to be eradicated. This division was not only economic, it was a moral and social abyss that deepened year after year. But behind statistics and political debates lay something far more cruel: the real lives of the enslaved. Families were torn apart at slave auctions, mothers ripped from their children, husbands sold to distant plantations with no chance of reunion. Children grew up never knowing their parents, many robbed of their childhood, working from an early age in the cotton fields, carrying sacks larger than their fragile bodies. To the masters, each person was nothing more than human merchandise, valued in coins and physical strength. The price of a body, to them, was more important than the value of a life. Even so, among chains and shackles, the flame of resistance never died. Many enslaved people fled in search of freedom through clandestine routes like the famous Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses and people willing to help. Others found refuge in hidden communities, recreating a free communal life, preserving African traditions, music, dances, and religions that the system tried to erase. This cultural resistance became spiritual strength to face the daily horrors of slavery. On the international stage, the United States began to face pressure. England had already abolished slavery in its colonies decades earlier, and France was moving in the same direction. As a young nation that proclaimed itself a defender of liberty and democracy, the United States carried a shameful contradiction. While declaring that all men are created equal, it kept millions in chains. It was an open wound that grew with each political speech, and with each new state admitted to the Union, raising the burning question: would it be free or slaveholding? This contradiction became unbearable. The country seemed to live in two parallel realities. On one side, the prosperity of the planters, the luxury of the grand houses, the political power of the southern states. On the other, the chains, the whipping posts, the lash, and the night's torment that turned the lives of the enslaved into a constant nightmare. Tension could no longer be contained in Congress or on newspaper pages. At any moment, the latent conflict could explode. And so, even before Abraham Lincoln entered the stage, slavery was already the line of fire dividing a nation. Each lash in the cotton fields, each tear shed in a slave hut, and each chain binding a body also chained the future of a country that called itself free, but did not yet know the true meaning of the word freedom. But after all, How could a man willing to defy the established order arise from so many chains and shadows? Who was Abraham Lincoln before becoming the symbol of the fight against slavery? Long before being remembered as the president who freed millions of enslaved people, Abraham Lincoln was just a poor boy, born in a wooden cabin in rural Kentucky in 1809. He grew up in the simplicity of rural life, working in the fields and helping his family survive. He had no access to renowned schools, nor did he inherit wealth or privilege. His formal education was scarce, but Lincoln developed an insatiable hunger for knowledge. He read borrowed books by lamplight, copied texts onto wooden boards, and fell in love with the idea that words could transform destinies. It was the beginning of the formation of a man who believed in the power of the mind above the chains that bound bodies. In his youth, he worked as a rail splitter, boatman, and even store clerk, interacting with different layers of American society. By navigating the Mississippi River and visiting southern cities, Lincoln witnessed firsthand the cruelty of slavery. He saw men and women sold in markets, treated as human merchandise, mothers separated from children, bodies scarred by the whip, and eyes lost in emptiness. These experiences left deep marks on his conscience. Although not yet a radical abolitionist, something inside him was unsettled in the face of such injustice. It was as if every chain he saw lit a silent flame that years later would erupt in powerful words. When he entered politics, Lincoln did not stand out immediately. His career began modestly as a state legislator in Illinois. But there he learned the game of power and began to shape his discourse. Instead of fiery speeches, he used simple rhetoric, yet charged with logic and morality. He knew how to connect with common people because he was one of them. Little by little, he earned respect in debates over the expansion of slavery. For Lincoln, even if he did not yet defend its immediate abolition, it was unacceptable for slavery to spread into new territories. Each new slave state would be another heavy chain on the nation. In the 1850s, the political scene in the United States was a powder keg. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act reignited the debate over allowing slavery in new territories. This opened the way for bloody conflicts like Bleeding Kansas, where pro- and anti-slavery forces clashed in brutal battles. It was at this moment that Lincoln began to rise nationally. His speeches against the expansion of slavery thundered amid the political storm. In one of his most famous pronouncements, he declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He foresaw the inevitable. The country could not continue half slave and half free. Lincoln's rhetoric led him to direct confrontations with powerful figures like Stephen Douglas, one of the leading defenders of popular sovereignty. The idea that each state should decide whether to accept slavery. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, crowds gathered to hear the sharp words of both men. Douglas defended the rights of the southern states, while Lincoln reminded the nation that slavery was incompatible with the principles of freedom and equality. Although Lincoln lost the Senate election in 1858, he gained something far more valuable: national prominence. His name was already engraved on the political map of America. But who really was Lincoln at that moment? He did not declare himself a radical abolitionist like Frederick Douglass or William Lloyd Garrison. He still feared directly confronting the Southern slaveholders. His struggle was, above all, to prevent the expansion of slavery and to preserve the Union. Yet, in his heart, the image of those slave markets he had witnessed still throbbed like an open wound. He knew the nation was heading toward an abyss, and that sooner or later he would be forced to take a more radical stance. The presidential election of 1860 was the turning point. Lincoln, running as the candidate of the newly formed Republican Party, presented himself as a defender of the Union and a critic of the expansion of slavery. His discourse was firm, but calculated. He did not promise immediate abolition, but he made it clear that the slave system could not continue to grow. This position inspired hope in the North, but provoked fear in the South. To the slave-holding elites, Lincoln was the embodiment of the threat to their privileges and their economy built on the whip and the chains. When Lincoln won the election, without even appearing on the ballots of some southern states, the reaction was explosive. Before he even assumed the presidency, 7 slave states broke away from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. It was proof that his mere presence in power was already seen as a death sentence for slavery. The division he had predicted in his House Divided speech was now before everyone's eyes, more real than ever. But how did Lincoln, a man who initially only wanted to preserve the Union, transform into the president who would proclaim the freedom of the enslaved? And how far would he be willing to go to fulfill that destiny? When Abraham Lincoln took office in March 1861, the United States was no longer a united nation. 7 southern states, with slavery as the foundation of their economy, had seceded and created the Confederate States of America. At the heart of this rupture was the defense of the right to keep millions of people chained, living under whips and shackles, sustaining the luxury of the grand plantation houses while surviving in miserable slave quarters. The fear that Lincoln represented the end of the slave system drove the Southern elite to break with the Union before the new president even had time to act. The first spark of conflict came with the attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861. The Confederates opened fire on the Union fortress in South Carolina, and the flames of war were ignited. The news spread across the country like lightning. For the North, the attack was an intolerable affront to the nation's integrity. For the South, it was the first act of defense of their peculiar institution, slavery. The Civil War, which began as a fight to preserve the Union, would soon reveal its true nature, a battle for the future of freedom. While cannons thundered, the lives of the enslaved remained unchanged, marked by the torment of the night, by cruel punishments, and by the whipping post awaiting any attempt at rebellion. On the cotton plantations, overseers tightened their control, fearing mass escapes. The chains grew even heavier, as if the South were trying to hold together a system already beginning to collapse. Yet amid the fear, hope arose. Many enslaved people saw the war as their chance to gain freedom. Every battle fought was, for them, more than a political clash. It was an opportunity to break their shackles. In the North, opinions were divided. Not everyone fought for the abolition of slavery. Many Union soldiers believed they were defending only the country's integrity, not the rights of the enslaved. Structural racism was so deeply ingrained that even among those opposed to slavery, there were many who rejected the idea of racial equality. Abolition was not yet the declared objective of the war, but with each passing month of conflict, it became clearer that there could be no victory without confronting the problem that divided the nation. The battlefields quickly turned into hells of blood and smoke. Thousands of young men died in the early campaigns, and the war, believed by many to be short, proved long and brutal. On riverbanks, in open fields, in burned villages, death spread like a plague. But amid this destruction, enslaved people fled en masse from southern plantations, seeking refuge behind Union lines. Some became workers in military camps, others, bolder still, enlisted as soldiers, turning the struggle for freedom into an armed act of courage. This mass flight began to put pressure on Lincoln. He knew slavery could no longer be treated as a secondary issue. Every broken chain, every whip left behind on the plantation grounds, every community of fugitives formed in the midst of war pushed American politics to a point of no return. The president, who had once promised only to preserve the Union, now faced a larger question. Could a free Union exist while half the country still lived under slavery's yoke? The South, in turn, hardened its stance. Confederate leaders openly declared that their new nation was founded on the superiority of the white race and the maintenance of slavery as a natural order. It was a system built on the blood and tears of the enslaved, and they were willing to kill and die to defend it. The slave quarters, whipping posts, and slave markets remained active even in the midst of war. The chains and the lash did not only silence bodies, they sought to stifle the cry for freedom already echoing on the horizon. Each battle seemed to intensify the moral tension of the war. For Lincoln, it was no longer just a matter of maps or borders. With every report he received from generals describing mass escapes of enslaved people, reality imposed itself. Slavery was the heart of the conflict. There could be no victory without striking at this institution. But taking that step meant risking further internal division, facing fierce criticism, and even losing the support of states that still tolerated slavery. As soldiers bled and enslaved people fled in search of freedom, Lincoln began to formulate a bold idea, a measure that would change the course of the war and the very history of the United States, to transform the fight for the Union into a fight for emancipation. But this decision would be a leap into the unknown, a risk that could either strengthen the Union or ignite it entirely. What would drive Lincoln to risk his presidency and even the survival of the nation in the name of freedom for the enslaved? Was the country truly ready to face not only war, but also the definitive end of the chains? The Civil War battlefields were not just sites of military strategy, they were landscapes of pain, mud, and blood. With every shot fired and every bayonet raised, the future of slavery hung in the balance. Young men, many still teenagers, left their homes to don the blue uniforms of the Union or the gray of the Confederacy. On both sides, they believed they were fighting for a just cause. Some for the preservation of the Union, others for the survival of a system built on chains, slave quarters, and whips. The first battle showed the world this would not be a short war. Green fields turned into improvised cemeteries, and the sound of cannons echoed day and night. The wounded agonized without proper medical care, and bodies were hastily buried in mass graves. Among trenches and smoke, the stench of death mixed with sweat and fear. And in the midst of this chaos, the figure of the enslaved emerged as a key piece, even without wielding weapons. Thousands were used by the Confederacy as forced laborers, building fortifications, transporting supplies, even tending to the wounded, all under the overseer's stern eye and the constant threat of the whip. But war opened a breach. Every movement of the troops was an opportunity for the enslaved to seek freedom. Many fled plantations at night, walking miles in the darkness, guided only by the moon and hope. When they reached Union lines, they became contraband of war, as Northern generals called them. They were not welcomed as free citizens, but as seized enemy property. Still, for those who had felt the weight of chains, this was the first spark of freedom. In Union camps, thousands of former slaves found refuge. Some worked as cooks, porters, or soldiers' assistants, while others enlisted to fight. The transformation was profound. Men once treated as human merchandise now wore blue uniforms and carried rifles, ready to face the very enemy that had enslaved them. Each shot they fired was not just against the Confederate army, but against the system that had scarred their backs with branding irons. Battles involving black soldiers became powerful symbols. Entire regiments formed by former slaves proved their courage and discipline in front of a country that still doubted their humanity. Marching side by side with whites, they showed they were just as capable as any other man. Yet even in the Union, structural racism did not disappear. Black soldiers received lower pay, were given more dangerous assignments, and faced discrimination from their own comrades. Freedom was still incomplete, but each step taken on the battlefield was a declaration they would never return to the slave quarters. Meanwhile, in the South, The pressure was mounting. Slaveholders feared that each military defeat would mean the loss of more human property. The slave quarters grew emptier. Hidden communities expanded in the forests, and control through the whip was no longer enough. It was like trying to hold water in one's hands. The more the war advanced, the more bodies slipped away from the chains. The whipping post, once enough to silence, could no longer contain the hope of a people who saw freedom drawing near. Lincoln followed everything closely. He received reports about mass escapes, about black regiments fighting bravely, about entire plantations abandoned. He realized that the war had changed. It was no longer only about preserving the Union. It was about redefining the very meaning of freedom in America. Every letter that arrived from the front carried the same message. Without confronting slavery, victory would be impossible. The nation's destiny was tied to the chains that still bound millions. In northern camps, newly freed men and women told their stories. They spoke of whippings that tore their backs, of children sold at auctions, of women abused by their masters, of endless nights of torment in the slave huts. These accounts circulated among soldiers, fueling morale and turning the war into something more than politics. For many, it was now also a moral crusade. Each battle made it clearer that fighting against the Confederacy also meant fighting against the perpetuation of the whip and the whipping post. But the war was costly. With every new battle, the number of dead rose at a terrifying pace. Men fell side by side, and the blood-soaked ground became a witness to the price of freedom. Lincoln knew he needed to give the struggle a new meaning, something that would inspire the North and demoralize the South. It was necessary to officially transform the war into a fight against slavery. Pressure was growing, and the world awaited his next step. The sound of drums and gunfire echoed as a constant reminder. Freedom was not yet guaranteed. Lincoln, seated in his office at the White House, knew the time had come to make a historic decision, a measure that would forever change the course of the war and the nation itself. What bold document was Lincoln about to sign, one capable of shaking the slave-holding South, turning the enslaved into soldiers, and redefining the future of the United States? The year was 1863. The country had already been engulfed for nearly 2 years in a war that seemed endless. Battles followed one after another in a cycle of death and destruction, and the Union needed a new sense of purpose to keep fighting. It was in this grim setting that Abraham Lincoln made the boldest decision of his life to transform the Civil War into a war for freedom. It was no longer just about preserving the Union, but about striking at the very heart of the system that sustained the Confederacy, slavery. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The document declared free all enslaved people living in the rebel states. The scene, recorded by history, was simple but carried immense weight. With a pen in hand, the president wrote words that would forever change the destiny of millions of men and women. In that moment, the whip, the whipping post, and the chains began to lose their power. It was as if light pierced through the shadows of the slave quarters, announcing a new dawn. But the proclamation was not perfect. It did not free the enslaved in states that remained loyal to the Union, such as Maryland and Kentucky. For many, it was an incomplete act. Even so, for those who lived under the terror of overseers, whipping posts, and nightly torments, the document represented hope. Enslaved people began fleeing en masse to Union-controlled territories, knowing that now, officially, they would not be returned to their masters. The proclamation turned the battlefield into a field of freedom. Lincoln's decision was both strategic and moral. By declaring the freedom of the enslaved in the rebel states, he weakened the Confederacy's economy, which depended on forced labor in the cotton plantations. At the same time, he gave the North a powerful moral cause. They were no longer fighting only for borders, but against the very system of chains that had stained America's soul. The war, which until then had seemed without a clear purpose, now had a banner: freedom. The reaction was immediate. In the South, the proclamation was met with fury. Slaveholders feared their captives would rebel or flee en masse. The slave quarters filled with rumors. Every word about Lincoln was repeated in secret, every sigh of hope whispered in muffled songs at night. For the Confederates, the proclamation was not just a military strike, but a direct threat to the world they had built with branding irons and blood. In the North, reactions were divided. Many celebrated Lincoln's courage, but others, even Union soldiers, feared that total abolition would bring unfair competition in the labor market. Structural racism was still strong, and the idea of seeing former slaves occupying places in free society stirred fear and prejudice. But Lincoln knew he could not please everyone. His mission was now greater: to redefine the very identity of the United States. One of the most immediate effects of the proclamation was the creation of black regiments. Men who had once been treated as human merchandise, appraised at auctions like animals, now marched in uniform, carrying weapons and fighting for the freedom of their brothers and sisters. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment became a symbol of this new army. Every step these soldiers took was a blow against the past of slave huts and whips. They fought not only against the Confederacy, but against centuries of dehumanization. The proclamation also had international repercussions. Countries like England and France, which had already abolished slavery in their colonies, began to view the Union with greater sympathy. It became harder for the Confederates to seek external support when their cause was so clearly tied to the defense of slavery. Lincoln had given the world a powerful message: the United States could not survive with chains binding its people. But the proclamation also brought risks. Lincoln knew he had placed himself in the crosshairs not only of Confederate leaders, but also of opponents within the North itself. Every word signed in that document carried the weight of a death sentence. And there remained a crucial question: how could those words be turned into reality? Declaring freedom was one thing, but ensuring that every enslaved person was actually freed would require even more bloodshed on the battlefields. Even so, the proclamation changed the spirit of the war. Enslaved people still suffering under the whip now had a real hope. Union soldiers fought with greater determination, knowing they were writing a new chapter in history. And Lincoln, solitary in his decision, became not only a president, but a symbol of the fight for abolition. The document that began as a military strategy had transformed into a moral banner. The war could no longer end with negotiations that preserved slavery. Now, any true peace had to be born from the destruction of the chains. But to what extent would the Emancipation Proclamation be respected? The South would continue to defy freedom, and Lincoln still faced enemies unwilling to accept his boldness. The question hanging in the air was, how much more blood would have to be shed before words became reality? The Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, but for millions of enslaved people in the Confederate South, reality did not change overnight. Many masters simply ignored Lincoln's decree, tightening their grip on the captives. The slave quarters remained crowded, the whipping posts were not destroyed, the whips did not fall silent, and chains still weighed on wrists and ankles. For those men and women, proclaimed freedom felt like a distant promise, a whispered hope, shared in tears through the silence of the night. The slave system, even in wartime, did not yield easily. On isolated plantations, overseers increased punishments, fearing rebellion. Branding irons burned innocent flesh once again, leaving scars of pain as reminders that submission was still demanded. Children were still torn from their mothers in makeshift auctions, women abused in silence, men humiliated before their families. Slavery, though wounded, still resisted like a cornered beast. But alongside the pain, resistance also grew. Enslaved people fled in larger groups, taking advantage of the chaos of war. Hidden communities in forests and swamps expanded, becoming sanctuaries of hope. There, away from the master's eyes, African traditions were preserved, music echoed as hymns of freedom, and dances became weapons against oblivion. It was proof that even under the whip, culture could not be destroyed. Every drumbeat, every song, every prayer was a way of breaking invisible chains. The accounts of those who escaped spread through Union camps. Stories of pain and courage inflamed soldiers and abolitionists alike. Some told how they survived dozens of lashings, how they walked entire nights to cross enemy lines, how they left behind families and friends with the hope of one day rescuing them. These narratives were not just individual memories. They were testimonies of a people who, crushed under slavery, had never stopped dreaming of freedom. Yet resistance also demanded a price. Many who tried to flee were captured and killed. Others were tied to whipping posts as cruel examples. Women who dared rebel were punished in front of everyone, their bodies turned into stages of torture. The torment of the night became even more feared as overseers invaded the slave quarters to punish any suspicion of conspiracy. Every attempt at liberation was answered with violence. The pain was profound, but the flame of freedom burned brighter with every lash. Lincoln knew his decree had not changed reality overnight. He understood that slavery, as a structure, would not fall with words alone. Battles had to be won, territories occupied, not only armies confronted, but also a mentality rooted in centuries of racism and dehumanization. While the North advanced on the battlefield, the South clung to its peculiar institution as its last pillar of identity and power. It was a duel not only of weapons, but of ideologies. On the battlefields, black soldiers now fought side by side with whites, yet many still felt the weight of discrimination. They received lower pay, endured humiliation, and were often assigned to the riskiest tasks. Even so, they marched with their heads held high. For them, the war was personal. Every victory meant the liberation of brothers, wives, and children still suffering in the slave huts. Every bullet fired was against the system that had chained them for generations. Resistance was not only on the fields or in hidden communities, it was also in black churches, where the Bible was read as a book of liberation. It was in the silent looks shared among enslaved people as they planned escapes. It was in the mothers who lulled their children with songs of hope, even knowing they might lose them at any moment. It was in scarred bodies that still rose each day to work, sustaining an economy that was collapsing. While the South resisted with iron and blood, Lincoln faced internal political pressures. Many accused him of going too far, while others said he had not gone far enough. Yet the war had already changed forever. Freedom could no longer be contained. Enslaved people had become active agents of history, escaping, resisting, fighting, writing with their own blood the nation's most painful and heroic chapter. And it was precisely this resistance, born of suffering, that turned the Emancipation Proclamation into something more than words on paper. The decree would only come alive as enslaved men and women rose against the system, and they did so day after day, even at the risk of death. But if the proclamation and resistance were already setting the South aflame, what would happen when the war finally came to an end? Would it mean full freedom, or only the beginning of a new kind of invisible chains? In 1865, after 4 years of bloody battles, the country was exhausted. Cities burned in ruins, cotton fields lay abandoned, and thousands of families mourned their dead. But for millions of enslaved people, every Confederate defeat was like a broken chain, a step closer to freedom. The South, once confident in its wealth built on slave huts and grand houses, now staggered under the weight of imminent defeat. In the war's final months, Hunger and despair gripped the Confederate States. Cotton, once the backbone of the global economy, was now worthless without enslaved people to harvest it. Many had fled, others were fighting alongside the Union, and those who remained no longer feared the whip as before. The slave system, which for centuries had seemed indestructible, crumbled before the master's eyes. The final battles were brutal. In places like Petersburg and Richmond, the fire of cannons lit up the night as Union soldiers stormed trenches built with the sweat of enslaved people. The Confederacy fought until its last breath, but defeat was inevitable. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Southern armies, met with Ulysses S. Grant in the small town of Appomattox. Before simple documents and weary faces, Lee signed the surrender. The war was over, at least on the battlefield. For Union soldiers, victory meant the end of the greatest conflict the United States had ever endured. But for the enslaved, the news of surrender spread like a divine wind. Many fell to their knees, weeping, thanking God. Others danced and sang, turning the silence of the slave quarters into celebration. There was still no certainty about how freedom would be lived, but something new filled the air. For the first time in centuries, slavery was officially defeated. The impact was immediate. In the streets of Washington, crowds celebrated. Flags waved, fireworks lit the sky, and Lincoln was hailed as a national hero. He had preserved the Union and, at the same time, broken the chains of millions of men and women. The dream of freedom finally seemed within reach, but despite the victory, the country was far from peace. The devastated South did not easily accept defeat. Many slaveholders saw surrender not as the end of a cruel system, but as a personal humiliation. Racism had not been defeated on the battlefields. It still lived in the eyes, the words, the hearts of those who refused to accept black people as free citizens. Slavery had ended on paper, but the struggle for equality was only beginning. And in the midst of this storm, Lincoln carried the weight of a costly victory. He walked the streets of Washington with a serious expression, knowing that rebuilding the nation would be even harder than winning the war. He spoke of reconciliation, of healing America's wounds. He planned policies to unite North and South without vengeance, but with firmness. He wanted to ensure that the freedom won would not be just an empty promise. Yet while Lincoln dreamed of Reconstruction, enemies moved in the shadows. Southern extremists and even Northern opponents saw him not as a hero, but as a traitor to his own race, a president who had shaken centuries of privilege. Those who had lost plantations, power, and status believed that Lincoln had destroyed their world. And it was in this climate of apparent victory and latent hatred that the country entered a new phase. The war had ended, the armies were silent, but America was still at war with itself. Little did those celebrating in the streets know that just days after victory, the very man who had freed millions of enslaved people would meet a tragic fate. What would happen to Lincoln when the gunpowder of the battlefield gave way to conspiracy behind the scenes? The war was over. The chains of slavery had been officially broken, and the United States was beginning to dream of a new era of freedom. Abraham Lincoln, exhausted but determined, spoke of Reconstruction, of uniting North and South, of healing the wounds left by the whip, the slave quarters, and the blood spilled on the battlefields. In the streets of Washington, crowds celebrated him as a hero. For many, he was the great emancipator, the man who had turned pain into hope. But while the people rejoiced, a silent hatred spread among those who saw the Confederacy's defeat as an unforgivable humiliation. Among these enemies was John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor, a fervent Southerner, and a defender of slavery. To him, Lincoln was no hero. He was a tyrant responsible for destroying the Southern way of life, for crushing the masters and freeing those he considered inferior. Booth believed that the president's death could restore dignity to the defeated South. Driven by this thought, he devised a dark conspiracy. On the night of April 14th, 1865, Lincoln decided to go to Ford's Theater in Washington to watch the play Our American Cousin. He wanted to relax, celebrate victory, and show the country that the time of war was over. He entered the theater accompanied by his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and some friends. The audience stood and applauded as the president arrived. It was a moment of joy, a pause after years of blood and pain. But in the shadows of the theater, Booth approached, carrying not only a pistol, but also the weight of the hatred that consumed him. As the play drew laughter from the crowd, Booth waited for the right moment. He knew exactly where Lincoln was seated, in the presidential box. When the audience's laughter drowned out surrounding sounds, he slipped in, aimed the weapon, and fired. The shot echoed like thunder on a calm night. Lincoln collapsed forward, unresponsive. Mary screamed in despair. Joy turned to panic. The hero of freedom had been struck down by an enemy invisible until that instant. Booth tried to escape. He leapt from the box, broke his ankle in the fall, but still managed to flee. In his mind, he believed he had become a martyr of the South, someone avenging the defeated masters, those who had lost plantations, power, and their dominance over the enslaved. But to the nation, his act would be remembered as cowardice, a desperate attempt to keep slavery's chains alive. Lincoln was rushed to a nearby house. Doctors did everything they could to save his life, but nothing could be done. Hours later, the man who had freed millions of enslaved people breathed his last. The news spread like an electric shock. Washington fell silent, and the entire nation mourned. Freed men and women, who only recently had lived in slave quarters, gathered in improvised vigils. Many fell to their knees weeping, others sang hymns of liberation, thanking God for the man who had changed their lives. For the newly freed, Lincoln's death felt like losing a father. Many believed he was the only one who could protect their freedom against those who still dreamed of restoring the past. His death left a dangerous void. Fear spread. Without Lincoln, who would ensure the whip would not crack again, that the chains would not return, that the whipping post would not once again punish black bodies. In the South, among some of the defeated, the news was met with bitter smiles. To them, Booth had delivered justice, but those smiles were short-lived, for Lincoln's death would not restore slavery. On the contrary, it turned the president into a martyr. The simple man, who had once split logs in silence, was now immortal, a symbol of a struggle that not even the bullet of a fanatic could destroy. The streets of Washington filled with mourning, coffins draped in flags, crowds in silence, tears rolling down faces still scarred by war. Lincoln's body traveled by funeral train, and in every city along the route, thousands came to say farewell. It was as if the entire nation wanted to thank one last time the man who had turned chains into hope. But as the country wept, a question began to echo. What would happen now? Without Lincoln, Reconstruction would be harder. Racism was still alive, the South still resisted, and the wounds of slavery still bled. The president's death could mean not only the end of a life, but the beginning of a new battle. Lincoln had freed the enslaved, but who would ensure that freedom endured without him? What would happen when the invisible chains of racism proved even more cruel than the chains of iron? The sound of cannons had gone silent. The blood on the battlefields was beginning to dry, and the flags of victory waved in the wind. Slavery was officially abolished, but the wounds it left behind did not disappear with the signing of a decree. On the contrary, deep scars remained etched not only on the bodies of men and women who had endured the whip, the whipping post, and the branding iron, but also on the soul of a nation that called itself free. Right after the war, The period known as Reconstruction began. The North sought to rebuild the country, while millions of formerly enslaved people took their first steps as free citizens. They dreamed of owning land, of building schools for their children, of a life where the whip would no longer be the law. Many created communities, churches, and associations, trying to build a future far from the slave quarters. For the first time, hope shone in the eyes of men and women who had been born as property and now sought recognition as people. But the reaction was swift and cruel. In the defeated South, black freedom was seen as a threat. Slaveholders who had lost their plantations and their power responded with hatred. The so-called segregation laws arose, restricting rights, blocking the vote, and keeping freedmen in conditions close to servitude. The iron whips and chains gave way to invisible chains. Inequality, forced poverty, structural racism. The slave quarters had been destroyed, but social exclusion became the new prison. Violent groups like the Ku Klux Klan were born in this period, spreading terror with white hoods and torches. They burned houses, lynched black men, and terrorized entire families. The newly won freedom often felt like a fragile dream on the verge of collapsing. For many freedmen, the fear of the slave quarters was replaced by the fear of the streets, where the color of one's skin was still a death sentence. Even so, resistance did not fall silent. Men and women who had once been enslaved now used their voices, their faith and education as weapons against invisible chains. Black churches became centers of community organization. Leaders emerged, denouncing injustice and demanding equality. African American culture flourished with music, dance, and traditions that kept the memory of resistance alive. It was as if every hidden community had been reborn in new urban spaces, where the fight for dignity continued. Lincoln's dream of a healed nation, where black and white would walk side by side, seemed distant. Segregation consolidated a divided country. Separate schools, different transportation, laws that reinforced exclusion. The whip no longer cracked in the fields, but the weight of racism continued to wound silently and constantly. The invisible chains proved just as cruel as those of iron, imprisoning generations in a cycle of inequality. Still, every step forward was a victory. The right to vote, won and so often threatened, became a banner. Men and women born in slave quarters became senators, congressmen, religious leaders, teachers. Every achievement was marked by blood and sweat, but also by an unshakable faith that freedom could not be erased. The legacy of slavery, however, did not end in the 19th century. It crossed time, shaping the United States we know today. Modern ghettos, police violence, social inequality, and structural racism are echoes of the past. The whipping post and the pillory were destroyed, but their shadows still hover over the present. Slavery left marks that cannot be erased by decrees or speeches. Looking back, we see that the Civil War was not only a dispute between North and South, but a struggle for the soul of America. Lincoln was assassinated, but his dream of freedom survived in the fight of millions. Every broken chain became a symbol. Every tear shed became a seed of resistance. The history of slavery did not end with the war. It continues to be remembered, told, and confronted to this day. The official end of slavery was only the beginning of a new battle against the invisible chains of prejudice, against structural racism, against the exclusion that refuses to die. But if history has shown us anything, it is that resistance never falls silent. From the hidden communities in the forests to the civil rights movement of the 20th century, from the muffled songs in the slave huts to the protest chants in the streets, the cry for freedom continues to echo. Slavery ended on paper, but its marks still breathe in the present. The question that remains is, how can we transform the memory of pain into the strength to build a future where no chain, visible or invisible, will ever again hold back freedom?